Hello, I'm Philip Chase and welcome to my YouTube channel on the best of fantasy. Today's video will be about Robin Hobb's Farseer trilogy, which, since it came out in the mid-90s, has become something of a classic in the genre. And it begins with Assassin's Apprentice, continuing with Royal Assassin, and ends with Book 3, Assassin's Quest. Now, as I said, this has become something of a classic in the genre. But I think it's only fair to acknowledge that many readers have expressed that the first book in particular is a little bit hard to get into, that it drags a bit, that the story takes some time to find its footing. And I will acknowledge that I did experience this myself. And I think there are a few reasons for it. One is that while Robin Hobb certainly uses many of the classical tropes and archetypes of fantasy, she also tends to do some of her own thing. She takes it off into different directions that are kind of unexpected. And I also believe that in the first book especially, she's really doing a lot of character building and giving us a lot of background. And this pays off in the later books, and also in some of the other books that she's written in this world where many of these same characters reappear. So, in my opinion, it is well worth the investment of getting through that first book in order to finish the trilogy. Now, one of the great strengths of the book is the character work. And the main character, Fitzchivalry Farseer, is also the narrator of the trilogy. Now, he is an old man looking back at his youth as he tells this story. And this is the story of him growing up as a bastard, a royal bastard of the Farseer family. The Farseer family are the rulers of the 6 duchies, and young Fitz grows up in Buckkeep, their castle, where he learns to become an assassin. It's a very successful narrative voice, in my opinion. You can feel the scars and the pain in this old man, and there's also a certain kind of wistfulness as he tells this story that feels very authentic to me and also piques my curiosity. I really want to know exactly what happened to him as a youth. Now, speaking of characters, I would have to say that the characters in this trilogy, I think, are very well done. And this is in great part because Hobb clearly understands the importance of conflict in order to make an interesting character and an interesting story. Fitz is a great example. He grows up with this duty to his family, becoming an assassin. And this duty precludes many of the things that he would like to do with his life, most especially perhaps his love interest. Unfortunately, his grandfather, King Shrewd, really does see fit to exploit him. It's difficult to tell if Shrewd has any genuine affection for Fitz. I think it's possible that he does. But what comes first is politics and the family. And Fitz is not much more than a pawn in that respect. Now, Fitz's uncle, Verity, who is next in line to the throne, does have genuine affection for him, but doesn't have a lot of time to show it due to his crushing royal duties and the threats from outside to the kingdom, which I'll get to in a bit. But it's really the relationships between the characters that make these characters alive. For example, the relationship between Fitz and Burrich. Burrich is the master of the stables at Buckkeep, the castle where Fitz grows up. And Burrich really is a kind of a rough father figure for young Fitz, who grows up with a great deal of love for Burrich, but also fear. And that has a lot to do with the type of magic that Fitz begins to show as a young man, and Burrich understands all too well. I'll be talking about that more in a bit, but it's called the Wit. Another great relationship in the trilogy is that between Fitz and Molly, his love interest. Now, there are a lot of obstacles that get in the way of Fitz and Molly, including the fact that he is a royal bastard and she is a commoner. And King Shrewd really wants to make use of Fitz. Perhaps my favorite relationship in the trilogy is that between Fitz and Night Eyes. Night Eyes is the wolf with whom Fitz is bonded through the Wit. He is something like a familiar. And it's really wonderful to see how Fitz and Night Eyes grow together. They save each other, and they become more and more like each other in some ways. So this is really one of the most special relationships. Of course, the thing about a familiar is done in many different fantasies, but Hobb does an especially great job with it in the Farseer trilogy. And there are some really other great supporting characters like Chade, who is the assassin who trains Fitz, and also, if he ever goes out in public, takes on a very interesting false persona. There's also the Fool, who is an androgynous character that has a very special relationship with Fitz. The Fool is something of a court jester, but there's much more to this character than that. And there's also Patience and Catricin, who are among many strong and really resilient women characters in the trilogy. In fact, it's safe to say that often it's the women who keep things together and who also help Fitz to get through his life and heal him at important times. Now back to the magical systems. Here we have really two primary types of magic in the Farseer trilogy. One is, as I said before, the Wit. This is beast magic. This is old magic, and it is forbidden, which is why Burrich is so alarmed when he first knows that Fitz has this type of magic in him, and he tries to get Fitz to suppress it. The other type of magic is called the Skill, and this is something that runs deep in the Farseer family. The Skill is a kind of telepathy whereby anyone who has it can influence other people, speak in their minds, and also communicate with other people who have the skill. Now, there are other types of magic in the Farseer trilogy as well, and these are much less developed, only kind of hinted at. Most prominent among them would be the Red Ship Raiders, the Out-Islanders who are the external threat to the Six Duchies. And these kind of Viking-type figures raid the coasts, and by some magical means, when they kidnap villagers and innocent people, they rob them of their humanity, and then they set them loose back on the Six Duchies to roam around like bloodthirsty zombies. And so these Forged Ones, they're called, because the first village where it happened was called Forge, are a threat to the kingdom that Fitz and his allies must deal with. But the Red Ship Raiders and their magic are perhaps something of a missed opportunity in a way, and maybe it's because this is really classical fantasy. If this were a modern fantasy, there would have been much more perhaps attention on this type of magic, exactly what happens to an individual. I think there might have even been a chapter where we have someone who this is done to, and we get a close look at it. For the most part, though, we really only see the Red Ship Raiders at a distance, and we don't exactly experience the hideous magic that they're using on these innocent people of the Six Duchies. In a similar sense, the other villains of the trilogy, this would include Fitz's uncle, his half-uncle, Regal, who is a sadistic and spoiled and nasty person, and also Galen, who is a sadistic sorcerer who is in league with Regal. These villains are something of a stereotype, frankly, but again, I think that's a product of this being a more classical fantasy than modern fantasy. And in modern fantasy, perhaps we would get much more of a look into the minds of these characters. Nevertheless, there is something that never changes about great stories, and this is something that Robin Hobb clearly understands as a writer, and that is that great stories with compelling endings contain both triumph and loss. In fact, the Farseer trilogy has many moments of physical and psychological trauma, as well as a great deal of sorrow. Fitz is, perhaps more than most heroes, truly scarred from his ordeals, a lot like Frodo, for whom carrying on in this world is really just too difficult. He is weary and broken, and he has some deep regrets at the end of things. And yet, it's the relationships that Hobb does so well that redeem this book and make it not only livable, but also beautiful for the reader who reaches the end of the story. And in fact, Hobb continues Fitz's story, along with many of the other characters you meet in the Farseer trilogy, in some of the other trilogies and books that take place in the same world. So if you enjoy the Farseer trilogy, there's plenty of more reading to do. For my next video, I'll be discussing another great story of the fantasy genre, one that is truly epic in scale, and you might even say is essential reading for the true fan of fantasy. So I hope you will join me for that video, and until next time.